You're listening to Investigation Insiders by Integris Intelligence.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Investigation Insiders. This is Forhad. Hope you are all well and safe. So we're doing something a little bit different today, but before I get into that, let me introduce our guest, William Losefsky. How are you, Bill? Did I do okay on that? Bill gave me a little bit of a lesson before we started the call on pronouncing his name correctly.
Yes, you did very well. Usually there's a 5 minute structured class on the pronunciation of that name, but you nailed it perfectly.
As I mentioned, I can empathize because people have a very difficult time saying both of my names. At least you're only dealing with your last name. But so let me jump into it. So here's what we're doing that's different, right? Bill is actually a listener of Investigation Insiders who I previously did not know. We connected several months ago when he reached out to introduce himself, and we had a great conversation and decided to do a show together. I just felt like Bill had so much knowledge, both from his experience as a law enforcement officer and since leaving. And so hopefully that describes the nature of our relationship, Bill. And perhaps you could start by giving our listeners a brief overview of your background.
Yeah, I mean, I had a multifaceted background of working both in law enforcement, which was a goal of mine. I think it's around age 7, I wanted to be a police officer, despite my family's opposition of being a cop in New York that was dangerous. But I really enjoyed that. And then when I finished that career, which was quite rewarding, I was a canine officer, I was the police prosecutor, detective, accident reconstructionist, worked on a lot of major cases, and it's always fun to and enjoyable to solve a case and put all the pieces together. Private investigation kind of came natural because I had that natural curiosity of wanting to find out exactly what happened and how it happened. So, of all the exams I've ever taken, the personal predictive index and the Briggs-Meyer, it all came back that I was an investigator. So,
Sure.
I figured I was in the right field for my life.
Sure. And so where did you serve as a police officer, by the way?
I started in the city of Yonkers, New York, which is actually the third largest city in New York State, and it borders the Bronx. And at that time, we had, I think, 520 sworn officers. So it was a pretty large department, and I was really exposed at a young age to all kinds of interesting things that you would not normally see, as a civilian. And then from there, I moved to New Hampshire and started with the Stratham Police Department in New Hampshire. And I really enjoyed the more rural setting. I was a Boy Scout growing up in New York, so any chance I could get out of the city and into the country, I was all for that. So it became a really good match for me moving up to New Hampshire.
Sure. You know what? I don't know if you knew this, but we have a connection to the Yonkers Police Department. The former police commissioner there, Ed Hartnett, is actually one of our senior advisors. But I don't think you worked with him, right?
I don't remember that name. I mean, I was, back, I started actually in 1979, so
Okay.
that was quite a while ago.
Sure.
And I had, what I call a sensei, Lieutenant Don Haggerty, who I've kept in touch with up until his death, and he's been kind of my mentor. As I moved up in rank, I always would connect out to him, and I still connect with Sergeant David Transinger, who's now retired from the Yonkers PD. So I still have close ties to that wonderful organization.
Sure. So tell me about so you talked about being from Yonkers. Can you talk a little bit more about where you grew up and how kind of you actually became a police officer?
I grew up in the southern part of Yonkers. It was so south that I would walk my dog into the Bronx. And there was Van Cortlandt Park, which was nearby, which was a massive park for a kid to go exploring in. We, had a lot of police patrol in our area. I wouldn't say it was a high crime area, but you would always hear police sirens and police activity. So at a young age, I was exposed to, seeing the police, do their jobs. And I just thought it was a really fascinating, field, especially if there was a burglary, you'd watch them respond and they do fingerprints and things like that. So, I think when you're 7, 8, or 9 years old, you kind of set up your life's path. And my friend Jerry and I both were so interested in police work that we went and signed up together and took tests, and we got on about the same time and very much enjoyed it.
Sure. So you joined the state of New Hampshire, right, as the director of safety, security, and emergency management. And while there, it appears that like you started your own company as well, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I actually started my PI business a few years before that, and I was doing it full time. And believe it or not, starting out, I ran into a bail commissioner, actually two of them, and started doing fugitive recovery work for them. And it was nothing that I wanted to start out with, but it was, we got really good at it. My partner Mike and I, we were able to capture everybody but one person. So we started out getting like 5% of the bond, and we quickly became, as Tony Soprano would say, good earners. So we got booted up to 10% of what the bond was worth. And then from there, I started to just take a lot of classes through the different PI organizations. And one of them was going out to Colorado and studying under Joe Dickerson on judgment and financial investigation. So I started to spread out my my skill set from being in the PI realm, and meeting people like Kelly Riddle and those type of folks that were on the top of their game around that time period.
Ah, interesting. So you what you're saying is you were Dog the Bounty Hunter before he was Dog the Bounty Hunter, right?
Well, we prided ourselves of doing things with less drama, but it's funny you mention that because the show Bounty Hunters kept reaching out to us, and they wanted to do a story of bounty hunting in New Hampshire, and we're trying to tell them that we're kind of professionals. People usually give themselves up. It's not a lot of drama, but they wanted to come up anyway. And one of the times that we were with them, we went to somebody's house, and it was somebody that skipped bail, and we went early on a Sunday morning. We figured there'd be no issues, and the guy wound up jumping out of the second story window, which you would think he would have broken both legs, but he was like 19 years old, 6'2", and he ran like a kangaroo. And Mike and I were chasing him, and of course the show people were behind us trying to keep up. So it was quite a spectacular event for them to capture. And so you never, as we say, you never know how something is going to go down. But we did wind up getting the person. He actually ran into the side of a police cruiser and kind of stunned himself, and I was able to jump on him at that point.
That's really interesting. So did that like get published or aired anywhere, or was that just for? I guess they recorded it and never published it.
It was in a newspaper article, but it was quite an interesting experience because it taught me not to have a big breakfast before I go do that type of job, because they paid for Mike and I to have this Denny's Grand Slam breakfast. So now we're running around with 10 minutes after eating, which wasn't the best situation for Mike and I.
That's funny, man. That's probably one of the funniest stories anyone has told me on this show. So, um, you kind of. So I was going to ask you if you had a good story about your time as a police officer that inspired you to become a private investigator. I don't know that you're going to be able to top the story you just told, but have at it, man.
Well, there was one case, like I said, I was the prosecutor for the police department. So I would take all the officers, tickets and arrests that were violations and misdemeanors, and I would actually go to court and prosecute the cases. And then when I wasn't doing that, I was investigating the high level cases. And there was one in particular, it had to do with a feed and grain store that had been burglarized. And they seemed to know, where the safe was. The safe was kind of like out of the way, and they got in through a window. It had an alarm system, but didn't trigger the alarm system. So there was a lot of things that didn't make a lot of sense. And, I only was able to get so far with partial fingerprints. I had like a half a boot print, but I had a tool mark. I had a really good tool mark of how they pried open the window. And, the chief kept telling me, he goes, "Oh, you still on that case?" And I said, "It's just been gnawing at me." So what I decided to do, Forhad, is contact other police departments to see if they had any similar type burglaries. Mm-hmm. And within 2 weeks, I found the same MO in the state of Maine and the state of Massachusetts with the same feed and grain store. And collectively, when all three of us detectives got together, we were able to get more than a partial print. We got a full fingerprint. We got a full footprint. The tool marks that I had in my window matched their tool marks. And then we came up with a suspect. And this probably took 3 months to put the whole thing together, but we were able to connect the suspect to all three crimes and actually get him charged in 3 different states. So that was, kind of like a Dr. Henry Lee criminalistics, kind of scenario of just methodically going after whatever evidence that we could find, collectively.
Sure. Yeah. And that was one of the things that I found interesting, like during our first conversation, which is sort of like the inspiration for the show, right? Is that, and you've been doing this for a long time, right? Like public versus private investigations. So, that's what we want to talk about today. And, as you've already set the stage, I think you have just fantastic experience to talk about both. One of the things I think is important is the missions, right? So can you talk about the mission of an investigation while you're employed as a police officer versus a private investigator?
Yeah, I mean that's an excellent question because they're very different, even though the type of work is the same and the investigative process may be very similar. But when you're working for like a town or a city or a county, you're out there to serve and protect. And if you find evildoers, your job is to prosecute them and make sure they go through the court system. Right. And it's pretty much cut and dry, and that's what you do for your 20 or so year career. When I got into the private sector, the mission was very differently. And a lot of times we'll hire, retired police officers or people that have law enforcement experience, and you bring them into the private sector, and they're locked into, they got to go to court and they got to be punished for this. Right. And I'll give you a really good example of how this differentiates. I was in charge of security for large hospital systems, and let's say somebody would take a computer monitor and smash it on the ground, and maybe the monitor had a value of less than $200. The officer's first instinct is, hey, we got to prosecute this person and take him to court. But then you look at the mission. The mission of the hospital is to take care of patients. So if your witness was, like, say, a high-level nurse and a nurse's aide, and now you have a security officer, and you got to bring all three of these people to numerous court hearings to extract $200 out of someone who probably doesn't have a job to begin with, that's not the mission. And a lot of times trying to explain to these younger security people and PIs, it's like it's not financially feasible to always prosecute people like you did in the law enforcement sector. So that would probably be a good example of the difference of the mission. The mission, in the private sector is to keep people safe and, find out, maybe we can secure the next monitor down and bolt it to the table so it can't be removed, as opposed to just, simply prosecuting people.
Sure. And I think you'd agree. I mean, we're also like client driven, right? So sometimes the client is looking for the problem just to essentially go away, and they want it to stay under the radar, and they don't want to make it a police matter unless it's obviously something so serious that you can't avoid it. So I think that that's whereas as a police officer you're working for the people, right, and keeping them safe, and as a private investigator you're working for your client and driven by what their goal is as well. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. When the phone rings and you're a private investigator, there's a probably 80% chance that the issue at hand, the problem that needs to be solved, is extraordinarily sensitive. And there's that trust factor. It could be an infidelity issue. A lot of times, somebody suspects their top employee from pilferage or stealing, and they're really putting their trust into the investigator to keep this information absolutely confidential and only report to them. And a lot of times, they just want to know one way or another what's going on. They might not even act on that, but it's just a burning desire to know what's going on and what the truth is. So we're always the, truth revealers, of very sensitive information.
Sure. So now that, again, we talked about the missions a little bit. Let's talk about the This is one thing, like, again, when you and I spoke initially, I just thought you sort of couched this brilliantly, right? Let's talk about the how the mission drives how you handle the investigation, evidence, and all that kind of stuff.
Well, what I always try to do is really sit down with the client and get the entire story. A lot of times they just want to tell you what they want and what their expectation is. But once you have the absolute full story and understanding and the background of what's going on, you can better assist the client. And I always tell them, we might not be able to get, your absolute goal, but what are your second and third, best, outcomes that we're looking for? So, you're out there with their initial mission, but, what can we do to get on base or get a triple as well, to make sure that, the client is getting what they need to. And we always, try to have them involved in the attorney, because a lot of times, even with a divorce, issue, they can spend thousands of dollars, having you dig up information that's not even going to be admissible in the court, due to previous court rulings and the way different states see evidence, that it's an effort that won't bear much fruit. So I think it's really important to go through the whole process of what tangible information is going to be useful in the overall outcome of the case, so the client is going in the right direction.
Sure. I mean, as opposed to like law enforcement, where like again, the end result is typically the end goal is pretty much the same, which is putting bad guys who've committed crimes into jail, right? Or prosecuting them, I should say. And so, but one of the differences I would think is just, again, with that, if someone commits a crime, evidence, how you handle it, chain of custody, all that sort of stuff becomes critical. Whereas, like what you just described, the mission in the private sector, all those things may not be as important because your goal is just simply to get the information and present it to them, not necessarily put someone away. What do you think?
Absolutely, and to get people to be on board and understand that. And as you get into the private sector and private investigation, you really understand the nuances. Like I did accident reconstruction on the police department for many years. I went to special schools for it. But when I got into the private sector, that's when I realized how critical it was to prove every element of negligence, because an accident is not looked at as someone's 100% wrong and the other person is 100% clear. There's percentages of blame, and sometimes when the insurance company contacts you, they'll say, "Hey, my client is 80% at fault right now. We know that he made some bad decisions, but we're looking to see if we can reduce his percentage." And a lot of times you'll go and find that a speed limit sign was obscured, or there was a street light out that should have been on, and had that light been on, or had that speed limit sign been more visible, his client could have reacted better. So now, you're starting out where he's 80% at fault, and now with your investigative efforts, he might be only 20 or 30% at fault. So it saves the insurance company a big payout, and it reduces the amount of negligence that was initially, put on the driver.
Sure, sure. Yeah, no, that's a great example. So what recommendations do you have for people transitioning from the public to private sector, or vice versa, really, in terms of investigative work?
Well, what I learned quickly from is to join your state organization, your PI organization, that networking, and you might even, go and ask someone to be your mentor, or they may just offer to be a mentor because they've got so many years of experience. Like our organization here in New Hampshire, the New Hampshire League of Investigators, we have investigators that are in their early 20s and some that are in their 70s, and all different walks and all different experiences. So it's really nice that you could pick up the phone or text and say, "Hey, I got such and such a case, what do you suggest I do?" Or any of the members, have experience with this. And then go to, other organizations that offer training. And, what I found is being in court is your training and your education is always going to be under question. So, invest in yourself, so you have the credentials and you have the experience that if you're, put on the witness stand, you have a firm, terra firma ground to stand on, that you have a certain amount of expertise to render an opinion or come up with a conclusion.
Sure, sure. What about, like, vice versa? What about going from, I guess, the private sector into, maybe law enforcement?
Well, you're going to go into, a paramilitary organization. The police academy in New Hampshire was much different than New York State. New York State, I went home every night after class was over. In New Hampshire, you stayed overnight, and you were marching, and you couldn't talk to people, and it was very regimented. So I think you have to get your body and your mind into that realm of what the expectation is. And again, what you brought up earlier, Forhad, is the mission. Always understand what the mission is. And if the mission is to have an impeccable looking uniform and a gig line and spit shine boots, then that's what you need to produce to do well. So it all goes back to the mission. And even individual police departments and agencies, their mission will vary slightly from one to another. So, I'd say embrace the mission and live it.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. So our and you've told a couple already, but our listeners, they love anecdotes, they love stories, right? So I was hoping you could sort of conclude here with a story that sort of encapsulates either in the public or private sector or both, how the execution of an investigation and something that you're proud of that you've been involved with.
Well, when I would, go into different organizations, I'd always ask them for cases that they can't solve. Some that have been, really gnawing at them, that was causing distress. And I had come across one in which a threatening message was put on an egg and left on a nurse's car where her windshield wipers were, and it was pretty upsetting to see that type of writing. And they had called the police. They had looked at their video cameras, and of course you have 500 cameras in a hospital, but not every one of them is in every particular place it could be.
Right.
So I inherited that case that was deemed to be unsolvable. And having had both statement analysis and handwriting analysis training, I kept looking at there was a couple of letters written on the egg that were very distinct writing. And what I would do is I'd take my lunch every day and go to the HR department and just look at application forms of people that work there. And by the third week, I came across an application that I had an absolute 100% match on numerous letters. And we were able to solve that age-old dilemma by confronting the person, and they wound up resigning. And, now that poor nurse, was able to put to bed that this wouldn't happen to her again. So that would be an example of using, some of the expertise that you learn along the way, and more importantly, be doggedly, in as Dr. Henry Lee would say, is everything is evidence until it is not.
Right.
Just keep working the case.
Yeah, again, that's really interesting. So that was just like a matter of like the person was upset at this nurse. Was there anything interesting about like the motivation, or was it just like a silly thing?
Well, it wasn't a silly thing. It caused this nurse, great distress to the
Yeah,
point where, she was terrified and afraid, and you really don't want to have that in the
sure,
workplace. Uh,
sure.
so I thought that particular case really needed as much work as you could put into it, because you really want, like I would always tell people, we can't protect you when you leave the business, from family life and stuff, but we can sure make sure you're safe once you enter the hallowed halls of the business. And
Sure.
that was one of those cases where, I couldn't say that to the person, but they were very relieved. And, all the officers were really amazed at how effective a skill set like handwriting analysis, statement analysis can be in a particular situation.
Sure. No, I was referring to the motivation of the individual writing on the eggs, meaning making threats.
Well, he had been having a relationship with, let's say, several people, and borrowing money from them, and it was, kind of a nasty situation. And
Uh,
I guess he was called to task of paying up some of these people that owed him money, and it was his way of kind of lashing out. I guess when he borrowed money, his expectation was never to be returning it, so he was kind of annoyed that he was being asked back for it, and he just wanted to make some people's lives miserable.
That's really interesting. Well, I appreciate that story, and again, I appreciate you joining us on the show. I thought, some of the things that you shared are really helpful and insightful. And you know how this goes. Like, you never know what resonates with who, and hopefully, someone listening, you connected with them in terms of what you were saying. And so I really appreciate you being on. Thank you to everyone listening, following, commenting, all the things that help us continue doing this. And we'll put Bill's contact information and his company information in the description of the podcast. Please do reach out to him if you'd like to speak to him or have a need in his area of the world, or reach out to us and we'll get you connected. But Bill, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you, Forhad, and I want to thank Josephine, your support for putting out such a professional and well laid out platform. Your podcasts are always welcome. As I'm in my vehicle listening to them most of the time, and you have some really awesome guests on there, and hopefully we spark some interest and enthusiasm to the listeners.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Till next time, everyone, have a good one.
Don't forget to follow us. We are on LinkedIn and Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube.